All right. Well, good morning again, and welcome to the 2025 Electric Rate Workshop. Now, for those who don't know me, who may be watching online or watching this recording later, my name is Brian Stubbert, and I'm the Chief Financial Officer and Assistant General Manager here at Turlock Irrigation District. And so with me, I have Scott Burnham, who is a partner with NewGen Strategies, and together we're going to be going through this presentation today on electric rates, cost of service study, and the workshop. And then also we have online, we have Michael Colantuno, who is our attorney, and so he will be coming in later on. I'll turn it over to him. And so he will kind of go through the process of what the rate process looks, but this will be at the end of the presentation. He's also available to answer any questions that anyone has throughout the presentation, so we do have him there. He wasn't able to attend in person, but he is going to be here remotely, and so we do have that. Please feel free to ask any questions of us along the way as we go through. And then, so just so we kind of know, just kind of the flow of the presentation is, I will start the presentation. I'm going to have a background. I'm going to talk about the district finances on, kind of where we are, where we had budgeted for this year. Then I'm going to turn it over to Scott, and he's going to discuss the cost of service analysis as well as the rate making that went with that as well. After he's finished, I will then come on. I'll talk about, where we're doing with the CARES program. I have a summary slide, talk about next steps. Then that's when Michael Colantuno will come on. He'll talk about the rate process, kind of going forward, the next steps. And then I'll come back with a slide on if anyone wants more information and have that available as well. So just that everyone kind of knows what, the flow that I had planned for this meeting. But again, it can be changed at any, based off of any questions we have as we're going through. So on the agenda, we're going to talk about the district finances. We're going to have, the rate analysis. We do have rate comparisons and then we have the CARES discount, we have the summary, and the next steps. So with that, I want to talk a little about the background. While we're here to discuss the rates, where we are, I just want to provide some background as to when was the last time we had a rate increase? What brought us here to this point? What have we done between when that last rate increase happened and where we are now? And so as we mentioned here, the last base rate increase was 10 years ago. So it was in 2014, around this same time. People are in front of you talking about it, and then that went into effect in January 1st of 2015, and so it's been 10 years since we have done that. Now, we have looked at rates, throughout as far as, is there, do we need to come back to you as a board for a rate increase, during that time period, but there was never the need to bring that back forward, and so we haven't had to do that. So this is the first time we've done that in the 10 years. And so what have we done over those 10 years in order to, help maintain where the rates are? Well, one of the things we've done is we have optimized the district's assets. The district has a vast variety of different generation assets, whether that is the natural gas power plants, it's the Tuolumne Wind up in the state of Washington. We have hydroelectric with Don Pedro. We also have numerous purchase power agreements that we have, whether it's the long-term solar agreement and others associated with that. We also use that. We also use the transmission that we have throughout the district in order to just optimize use of those resources whenever it makes the best sense economically for the district and for our ratepayers, and that has helped us to contain this as well. New things like the EIM, that is something that has actually helped us been able to kind of work with those costs and be able to save there as well, which has been a direct benefit. I think Tricia gave a presentation last week in which she was saying just so far this year through September is like $4.2 million is what that net benefit was. And so those are some key things that we have that we really look at how we can help out. Utilization of reserves. For the last number of years, we have actually had fairly decent reserves. And we have a cash reserve policy, and that cash reserve policy has a target range between 225 days cash on hand and 275 days cash on hand. It talks about what we do if it's over the 275. We can use that cash for other things like cash funding capital, paying off debt, aspects like that is at the discretion of the board. And then it talks about what happens if it drops below 225 days cash on hand. And so if it drops below 225 days cash on hand, we have 3 years in which to get that back up within that range, that 225 to 275 day band, because we didn't want to necessarily have just a forced, knee-jerk, really high rate increase that needed to happen. We wanted to be able to take our time and be able to smooth that in over 3 years. And so that's what we've been able to do, is utilize those reserves. We've been above that range. We're still, at the end of last year, we're still a little bit above it, but we are coming down into that range, and we're looking to see, and we are seeing in the projections that we could be dropping below that, which is why we are here today, talking about, looking at rates. And then also just controlling expenditures. As I mentioned, we're always looking at EIM. That's a way in which we can, optimize our assets, but also control expenditures. And how do we factor into that? That's also another factor for how we've been able to maintain the rates that we have over the last 10 years. And so now I want to go ahead and move into a little bit of information. So this is what was presented at the October 8th O&M budget meeting, budget workshop. And so this is just a slide that shows where we were in 2023 actuals, what our projections are for 24. It has the budget for, original budget for 24, and then where we had, the draft budget for 25 with our current rates. And so if you look to the very bottom, there was a new line that was put in. That's the estimated days cash on hand as of 12/31. And so that was a request by Director Yonan, so we included that in there. And so you can see that we are projected to be at estimated days cash on hand of 224 to 237 days cash on hand at December 31st of 24. Now, I will say on that one that is just a range, and it's an estimate. It could be different than that. It could be higher. It could be lower. There's a lot of things that factor into that calculation. The other aspect is, looking forward to 2025, is we're looking to be between 190 and 202 days cash on hand, which is below that, that threshold of the 225 days cash on hand. And so that, again, that's a projection of where we think that we could be, and that is, again, without a rate increase there. If you look one line above that, to that number that says 1.41, that is our debt service coverage calculation. We have historically budgeted to 1.5 times it. And what that means is that the cash available line, that is, where the red A is next to it, that total cash available, that number we budget for that to be 1.5 times what your TID debt service is, which is that $34,500,000. And so that allows us to pay for debt service, that allows us to cash fund capital, and it's also good from a rating agency perspective. They look at those numbers to see where we are at. So you can see they're at 1.41. So both of those metrics indicate that we would be, kind of in that below where we are targeted to be from a debt service as well as an estimated days cash on hand basis. So now we kind of wanted to look at similar information, but put in as a comparison what would happen if we added the proposed rates in there. And so if we increase the rates, it's about $15 million. If you look up there under the retail electric, it's about $15 million that would be added in for this year. And then you look down under the water operating revenues, and that increased about $200,000. And so that's what we have, as far as what those proposed rate increases would be. And if you drop down to the bottom again, you'll see that the TID debt service coverage moves up to 1.86, which is in line with where we had budgeted in 24 and very similar to where we think our projection is going to be for this year. And it has our days cash on hand at 204 to 216 days cash on hand. Now, that's still below what the 225 days is, but if you remember what I mentioned previously, is that we have 3 years in order to move up into that range. And so a question that has, that would come up, and I know has come up, is what would happen, or when would we actually be within that range? And so to be within that 225 days cash on hand, based off of the estimates that we're seeing, it would be in 2026, we'd hit around 230 days, and then be at 232 days cash on hand in 2027. Just kind of give you a reference, a frame of mind of where we're at with that.
Not actually below until we have that look-back method in our policy.
That is correct. As far as when that timer starts, this is the projection. That is a very good point, Director Alamo, is our policy does state that it is on a look-back basis. So we look at, after the audit is done, we look back and we calculate it. And so that is something that you're absolutely right. That timer doesn't necessarily start until then. But we do want to look forward to just see where do we think we could end up, which is why it's an estimate of where we think that we're going to be. So now we're going to be looking at the capital budget that we had for this year. And so this is the 3 years, next 3 years for the capital budget. And so what you can see here is on the capital budget, it averages about $106 million a year over the next 3 years. Now, not all of this is going to be cash funded. There's a chunk of this that is a large chunk of this that is going to be debt financed, per what we put into the cost of service. And that ends up being roughly around about a 25% to 75% split. For 2025, it's 26% is short-term capital and about 74% is long-term. And what we do is we are just, for the cost of service purposes, we look at any asset that has a useful life of 20 years or more, and we categorize that as long-term. Any asset that has a useful life of less than 20 years as short-term. And so what we did for this, for the cost of service study, is anything that is in that long-term, we actually have it in there as being debt financed during that portion. Anything that's in the short term is going to be cash funded. Now, it's not going to be project for project. It's not going to necessarily be dollar for dollar, but it'll be in that dollar range. But that was just something we used in order to budget as we move through. So I also wanted to show where that our capital investments have just increased over the years. And in the next slide, I'm going to talk about why. Why have they increased, and what are the major areas? And so I will get into that in the next slide, and I'll have a couple examples with some projects. But I just wanted to show this real quick. And this shows the net capital investment from 2014 through 2023. That's the actual in blue. The current year projection is there in 2024. And then in 2025 through 27, it's kind of that lighter orange. That is what we just shown on the previous page. That's kind of that 3-year span. And then I also wanted to show what years 4 and 5 were. So you can see that there has been a change in those expenditures over that time period. And so now the logical question is why? Why are those going up? Well, there's 3 main areas of focus. One is reliability. The other one is infrastructure. And then the third one is state mandates. I'd say one of the bigger ones for reliability is longevity as well as efficiency of resources. The Don Pedro Life Extension Project, that is a project that is in the middle. We're still in the middle of that. I would say over the next 3 years, there's about $65 million on a net basis. That's TID's portion of that. That's not MID's portion, but just TID's is over the next 3 years. But that'll also extend the life by 50 years, and it will also increase capacity by 30%. There's the maintenance and improvement of existing generation facilities. Outside of that, we have WEC, we have Almond, we have Almond 2 that we are maintaining as well. WEC major inspections and overhauls over the next 3 years is $11 million. Again, these are some large dollars in there that we have. Inspection and replacement of poles and wires throughout the district. That's multi-million dollars each year that we are going through and inspecting and replacing that infrastructure. And then addition of generation, distribution, and transmission. We're going to be purchasing land for 2 new substations. We need to build new substations in Ceres as well as in Patterson. And then we need to identify and procure energy storage opportunities. What are some, there are batteries that need to be put in out there. State mandates, meeting aggressive state energy goals. There is a state mandate of 100% carbon-free by 2045. All of those costs go into this. Also state mandates regarding just the river flow and, the Tuolumne project that we have. I think what is the Lower Tuolumne River Habitat Improvement. That's $5 million a year to the district over the next 3 years is what is in the budget. And so those are all expenditures that go into what we have in our capital budget. There's also the transition of our medium and heavy-duty fleet vehicles to zero emission, and then also being in compliance with vegetation management mandates. All of this factors into these numbers. But one thing I do want to say is that before I turn it over to Scott, this cost of service looks at the district as a whole. So it looks at the electric side, it looks at the water side, it looks at everything in total. What we have today is this is the electric workshop. A week from now, on November 5th, we're going to have a second workshop, and that's to talk about the water rates. And so we are going to have both of those, but this is going to be just on the electric side. And Scott does have a slide that shows the split of the cost between the electric and the water, but I would say the lion's share of the presentation is going to be just on the electric side of the business. Are there any questions before I turn it over to Scott?
If I can deviate for a minute, on the debt that's going to be financed for the long-term assets, so if you roughly assume $75 million a year is the long-term times 5 years, that's about $375 million, actually probably a little more than that. Is the plan to do that 1 year at a time, kind of draw down, put debt in place for 2025 and then wait till year-end 25 to look at 26, kind of do it 1 year at a time?
So what we haven't devised the exact plan yet, but what we have done in the past is we have opened up a commercial paper line, similar to what we have on the WEC side, but we had it for TID. Back in 2020, it became just too expensive to maintain, so we let that go away. We would start that back up again, and we would use a commercial paper line, and we'd get something like maybe either $50 or $100 million on that commercial paper line. You wait for that commercial paper line to get to where it's, say it's a $100 million line, get up to about $95 million, and then that's when you would then do a funding in order to convert that from that short-term commercial paper line into a long-term borrowing. And so that might be at the end of the year, that might be into the beginning of the next year, but that is just how we would fund that.
It does allow us to be flexible when things change.
Yeah, I like going slow, doing 1 year at a time, see how the year ends,
Right.
then look at doing the next year and the next year and the next year. So
And that gives us the flexibility to do that.
that's you answered it perfectly. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Scott.
Great. All right. Board President, Directors, as mentioned, my name is Scott Burnham. I'm a partner with NewGen Strategies and Solutions. It's my pleasure to be before you today to talk about the cost of service study and the rate design recommendations that we're making. I'm going to walk through some of the rate process overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about revenue requirement and how that's developed, then talk about the electric cost of service process itself, the results of the rate study, and again, sort of the recommendations. As we go through this, certainly feel free to ask any questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. So when we think about the rate study process overview, there's sort of a 5-step high-level process. The first is determining the revenue requirement. The revenue requirement is the dollars, right? How much dollars do we need for a certain period of time? Determining that, working with Brian and his staff to help develop that. The cost allocation process is something of a 3-step process. We look at the different functional elements within the district's operations. We'll talk about that. And we classify these costs into demand and costs. And then we allocate them. And the final allocation process is where we take those costs and then assign them to the customer classes. Ultimately, what comes out of that cost allocation then is a net revenue requirement by class. We then use that net revenue requirement by class to design the rates to recover those costs. So there's sort of a systematic process. This is an industry standard process that we go through to look at cost of service and allocate costs to different customer classes and then ultimately recommend rates. So when we talk about the revenue requirement, as Brian mentioned, we're talking about sort of the total system at first. We look at the electric, the water. We look at all the different components of the cost elements. And on the electric side, we're looking at sort of operating expenses. So we have fuel, purchase power, combine that into power supply. We're looking at transmission, distribution, customer expenses. We're making an adjustment for some Don Pedro generation expenses. I'll talk about that in the next slide. As Brian mentioned, you guys are making investments in the future. So there's debt service, there's current debt service and projected debt service relative to those capital improvements, as well as cash for those capital improvements as well. So there's a mix. And then other revenues and expenses. Now, one thing is we look at what we call a test year, and a test year is a future year. For this assignment, we're looking at 2027, and we're saying we're going to estimate and project these costs for 2027, project these revenues for 2027. And the reason why we chose 2027 is it's a 3-year period, and we want to gradually get there. We don't want to necessarily just immediately change rates and have a lot of rate shocks. So we kind of want to smooth into the new rates and the new revenue requirements. So, when we think about some of the elements of the revenue requirement, Don Pedro is a hydropower facility, as you're aware, and there is value that is provided to the electric utility by nature of the water running through the hydro facility. And so that value is in this, what we put together as a revenue requirement, as a cost to the electric utility. So it's an internal transfer between the electric and the water side of things, but it does represent a true cost to the electric side. And so what we're saying is that how we're valuing that true cost, we're saying that the total value of the water that goes through the hydroelectric system has a market value. In theory, the water system could indeed sell that power in the market. So we're valuing it at a market in 2027, and then we're subtracting there are costs to the electric side to operate and maintain the hydroelectric facility. So we're saying that there's a total energy value. We're subtracting out then the hydro costs that are paid by electric currently, and those are in the revenue requirement as O&M costs. And then that net value is then what we're saying is a transfer or a true cost to the electric that is transferred from the water side to the electric side. So it becomes a cost on the electric side and a credit on the water side. And you'll see that in the next slide. So we're including that in the revenue requirement as part of this study. So these are the elements included in the revenue requirement. We have power supply. You can see we've got a test year for 2027. Power supply, we've got non-power supply O&M, so the operations maintenance of the systems. We've got those existing debt service. We've got new debt service. There's a capital funded by cash. And then you can see there's that hydro-related cost transfer. So there's that $8.5 million that becomes a cost to the electric and then a credit to the water side. Brian mentioned the deposits to reserves for metrics. That's certainly an element that is within this relative to the cash flow needs and the financial metrics. And then we have some discretionary revenue, as Brian mentioned earlier in the budget update with the wholesale sales. We're estimating what those wholesale sales will be into the future, and we're applying those discretionary revenues because what we really want to get to here is a net revenue and a net retail revenue requirement because we're talking about retail rates. We're not talking about wholesale rates. So we're basically taking all the costs and then subtracting out the benefit from the wholesale sales to get to a net total retail revenue requirement. As you can see, then we're looking at how does that split between the electric and the water. The majority of the costs are the electric. The total revenue requirement for the electric is the $372.2 million for the fiscal year or for the test year of 2027, and then the water is approximately $11 million. So it's about a 97% to 3% split relative to that cost.
Take 30 seconds and say how you got the hydro value of the $8.5 million.
So when we're looking at the hydro value, we're saying there's a water that flows through the hydro facility and generates a certain amount of electricity. That electricity has a market value, right? We could sell that electricity into the CAISO, and we're saying that total value of the electricity in 2027, estimated flows and estimated generation, is $24.5 million. We're saying that value then could be ascribed to the water system because the water system owns that water, flows through it. But there's also a cost to operating the hydro facility. That cost of operating that hydro facility is approximately $16 million for 2027. So we're taking the net difference between the two to say that becomes a cost element for the electric system to pay the water system for, and essentially for the fuel or for the water that's flowing through. So it's a transfer to that as a cost element based on the market value of that electricity.
Thank you.
That $60 million is the cost of running the 392,000.
Correct.
Yes.
It includes capital as well as operations maintenance as well, but yes. Yes. And that's the estimate for the year is that hydro generation through there, so yeah. Okay.
One thing I did want to also point out, go to the next slide, Scott, on that one is, He had mentioned, as far as the discretionary revenue, he had mentioned the wholesale sales, the electric sales. That's one aspect to it, right? There's property taxes, there's interest income, there's multiple things in there. So I want you to know that that was one component, but it wasn't the only thing that's under that one. So.
So when we get into the cost of service, again, looking at this multi-step process, we've developed the revenue requirement. We've taken the total cost, we've taken the debt, the transfer, the capital, less the discretionary revenue to get this total net revenue requirement. We then look at the functional cost. We functionalize these costs because ultimately we're trying to get to is cost causation. Why are these costs? Why is the $372.2 million being incurred? And who's responsible for it? What classes are responsible for it? To do that, we look at the different functional elements and we say, okay, there's 4 business units, if you will, in the district's operations. There's power supply, transmission, distribution, and customer. We then classify the cost as the underlying nature of the cost, and then ultimately allocate it then to the customer classes. And we're going to walk through each one of these functional and classification and allocation process. So when we think about a vertically integrated utility, which is what the district is, meaning that they own generation. So you own generation, you own transmission assets, you're generating the power at the generation side and buying it, of course, on the wholesale market as well. You're moving it through your transmission assets. You're then stepping it down to the distribution side of things. The distribution side then connects the power to the load, and the load is your residential customers, your commercial customers, your industrial customers, your farmers, et cetera, that are using that power. And so each one of these business units has certain characteristics and certain elements that we utilize to allocate to those classes ultimately. So when we think about the power supply, that's where we're either making or buying power to serve load. And we think about the size of the power supply. The size of the power supply is related to the capacity, the total need. It's ultimately to the demand or the load side of things. So we're trying to meet that peak load by the sizing of both the assets you own as well as the power purchase agreements that you're entering into. And that's a fixed cost, right? So at the maximum, the investments are a fixed cost. The energy is then what's produced by those assets, right? So you're spinning a resource, you're generating electricity, whether or not that's you're burning fossil fuel, wind, hydro, solar, whatever it may be, but you're meeting the variable electricity needs of customers over time. So over the course of a year, over the course of 3 years, whatever it may be. That's the energy side of things. So there's 2 components when we think about the power supply function. There's a capacity or demand component and an energy component, which is variable, and a capacity component, which is fixed. When we think about the transmission function, again, we're moving that electricity from the generation assets through the system to ultimately to the distribution system. The sizing and the requirements of that transmission system are designed to meet that peak load as well. So they're designed to meet peak demand. You're also purchasing transmission service, if you will, on a variable basis. So there's a combination of both fixed and variable components to the cost structure when we look at the transmission function as well. When we think about the distribution function, again, this is where we're taking it from that transmission system. We're then, putting it into the energy is moving into the customers, ultimately into the neighborhoods, into the distribution systems, the substations, the transformers, the lines, the services. Now, the sizing of the distribution function and the investments, and therefore the investments, are related to the maximum demand, but it's a different demand, and we'll talk a little bit about that, about kind of what that means and why that's important. But ultimately, this is where you're actually connecting to the customer. And then lastly, there's a customer function. The customer function of the district is utility billing, the customer service when people call up and have questions about their bill. It's also about programs like energy efficiency and the like, and the execution of those programs. And it's also about the communication and information, the messaging that you're getting out, the community outreach, the investments you're making in that service and that service offering to the community to tell people about the value of the services that you're providing. So when we think about this functionalized cost, and we look about across the 4 different functions. So there's power supply, transmission, distribution, and customer. They're all totaling up to that $372.2 million. That's that net system revenue requirement. The power supply, obviously, they all include, fuel, O&M, just debt service, capital, and some allocation of the reserve for metrics. That power supply is generally by far the largest element, the 74% for you guys, and that's generally what we see. Usually followed by distribution at 17%, and then transmission and customer. So those prorations across the different functional elements is about what we see in a typically vertically integrated utility. So what we're going to do is then apply the discretionary revenue, the discretionary revenue that's been allocated to electric, to the total functionalized cost to get that $372.2 million. So the cost classification is again a process to understand the underlying nature of these costs. We're trying to establish cost causation. Again, that's the name of the game for cost of services. Who's incurring these costs and who's responsible for them, so we then can assign those costs to those classes and recover those in rates. So costs are said to be either fixed or variable. So fixed costs are those that would change with capacity additions, the investments, vary, again, by demand. So demand is an important related concept when we think about fixed costs, because those are where we're trying to assign, again, classify these costs as either demand-related, fixed-related, customer-related, or variable. And the variable costs are those, again, related to the usage, the generation of electricity. So we're saying that those are vary with the energy consumed, delivered, or purchased, and really it's primarily energy cost. Now there's probably some variable O&M as well that's in there as well in terms of a variable cost, but that's pretty minor. So one way to think about sort of that split between fixed and variable is with a car, right? So a car, if you purchase a car, you obviously have fixed and variable costs. The size of the car, the capacity, the demand, if you will, of the car, larger cost. So those monthly car payments are fixed. Whether or not you drive that car or not, you have to pay for that. You also have to pay for the insurance. You also have to pay for license fees. So you have to have it kind of all ready to go. Really, the variable costs then are the gas and fuel to move the car, and perhaps some variable O&M in terms of oil changes and the like. You can see this car, we're showing a 48%, 52% split, and we'll see this again in the future in a couple slides here. That represents the district's sort of fixed and variable cost mix as a system total. And we'll talk about kind of what that means. The last step in the process is the cost allocation. So again, this is where we're saying we're going to assign the total revenue requirement, the net revenue requirement, to the various customer classes. And we're using the class characteristics and usage and measurements of how these classes as combined are using electricity on the system to then assign those costs. So the ultimate goal we're trying to get to, again, is that cost causation. The cost causation is really what's driving the whole cost of service analysis, and why we're saying that some customer classes have more cost causation and some have less. And so therefore, that's ultimately what we're trying to get to, is to align those within the system and then recover those in rates. So when we think about allocation factors, we say, well, how are we allocating? Well, we're using allocation factors, and there's a variety of allocation factors that we can use. And this is why that classification is so important, because we're using different allocation factors for different usage characteristics. So when we think about demand-related allocation factors, we're looking at something called coincident peak, which is saying, okay, there is 1 hour of every month that the system is peaking. At that hour, what are the customer classes doing? How are they contributing to that? Because that's contributing to the costs. So we're looking at that characteristic as a method to assign fixed costs. That's why we have to know what the fixed costs are. The non-coincident demand is looking at the class as a whole, and when that class peaks. Now, sometimes the class may peak at the same time as the coincident peak, or sometimes it may not. So again, non-coincident peak is another cost allocation, demand cost allocation methodology that we use to assign costs. And then sum of max demands is ultimately the demand that each individual customer within a class is putting on the system. everybody puts demand on the system, whether or not they get billed for it, they are putting a demand on the system. And so that characteristic is used in the allocation process. We'll talk about that in the next slide as well. We also look at energy-related usage, so kilowatt-hour sales, that monthly sales. And what we do is we gross that up for losses, and that's what we call as net energy for load. So as you know, if you if you're generating a 1.1 kilowatt-hour of electricity, as you move it through the system, you're selling 1.0 kilowatt-hours of electricity because there's losses. That would assume a 10% loss, but in theory, you're losing that, and we include that in the study. So net energy for load is a cost allocation process we use for variable cost. Again, why it's important to understand what those are. And then finally, we use customer-related, so number of customers, just pure meters, number of customers. And then we also use a weighted number of customers. So the idea of a weighting number of customers is that some classes may have different cost incurrence relative to the customer function. So you can imagine that a residential customer and a street lighting meter are two different cost functions, right, in terms of how much cost incurrence they're requiring on the customer service side of things. So they're different, and so we weight them differently to assign costs differently. And there's pretty much some industry standards we use for those weighting. So demand cost allocators, again, there are three types of demand cost allocators we're looking at. We're looking at that coincident peak, non-coincident peak, and sum of max demands. And the way you can think about this is if you think about the continuum of a generation facility here, distribution sort of in the middle, and the customer over here on the right. On the generation side of things, what you care about is that system peak, because you have to have the assets in place and or the power purchase agreements in place to meet that peak load. So you care about what that peak load looks like. So you're using a coincident peak or system peak demand allocator to then assign those costs. But when you're in the middle of the system and you're looking at the distribution system, you don't really care about the peak so much. What you care about is what the classes are doing, because that's driving the cost, the infrastructure cost for the distribution side of things, right? The peak is driving the cost, the system peak is driving the cost for the generation side. The non-coincident peak is driving the cost for the distribution side of things. And ultimately, when you get to the customer and you're down at the service drop and transformers and right close to the customer, it's more about what the customer and how the customer is using power than it is about what the system peak is. It's more about, hey, what's this guy doing? How is he using electricity or she using electricity? And so we're looking at a sum of max demands cost allocation process for these set of costs. So there's a variety of different costs and a variety of different allocation factors that we're using to assign costs in a fair and equitable manner. And these are all sort of industry standard techniques that we use. So here's an example when we're looking at a 12 CP, coincident peak, demand allocation. Again, we're looking at the test year 2027. And we're saying is that we've determined that there's a peak load cost on the system on the generation side of $41.8 million. And we're saying, okay, when we look at the 12 CP, this is the average monthly peak demand by class. The residential average monthly peak demand is 2,257 megawatts out of a total of 4,703. That's approximately 48%. You can see that on the top line there. So we're basically saying, okay, of that 41.8 million, residential class as a whole has a 48% cost causation. So therefore, they're being assigned $20.1 million of this $41.8 million total in terms of their cost causation in developing their individual revenue requirement. So each class has a revenue requirement. And so we go through this same process for all the costs, for all the allocation factors, and for all the classes, and to develop sort of what we're calling the net revenue requirement by class. And that's what we have here is the net revenue requirement by class. So we're saying there is a total for the system of the $372.2 million. Each customer class contributes to that, and it contributes to that based on the cost allocation methodologies that we've applied. We're saying that their residential, for example, is $160.7 million revenue requirement. And then we say, okay, at current rates, again, we're looking at 2027. At current rates, if we project those current rates and project those revenues, as they are right now, the residential would generate approximately $3 million. So there's a shortfall. So we're saying, okay, over the course of this 3-year period, we're going to pick up that shortfall of approximately $24.4 million for the residential class. Ultimately, in the total system, the shortfall is $49.4 million. So again, that's to meet all the revenue requirements that we've determined. We've determined what those costs are. We've allocated them, and now we're saying we're assigning those to the classes and looking and saying what is the cost responsibility by class, and how ultimately are we going to recover that in rates. So when we think about the rate study, again, this is where the last step is how do we recover those costs? Well, the rates are a price tag that we're putting on electric service, right? So we're saying, hey, this is the value that we're providing in our electric service. We're combining that cost of service analysis, we're providing some policy elements, and we're providing the pricing. One of the things that when we look at the rate at the rate design, we look at the different customer elements. So there's a customer charge, demand charge. Some classes have demand charge, some classes don't. Energy charge, there's pass-through. You guys have a power supply adjustment charge. You have an environmental charge right now. And some of the policy elements here that we're including are trying to increase that fixed cost recovery. We'll talk about that in the next couple slides because there's a risk management element. The less kilowatt hour sales, then and if you have fixed costs in a variable cost recovery, then you're getting less fixed cost recovery ultimately if there's lower sales. And so a lot of utilities are doing this to move that cost recovery more in alignment with the cost incurrence. And then ultimately, as I mentioned, the environmental charge is going to get moved into the energy charge. And we're going to essentially kind of do away with that as a line item on the bill. And again, these are all elements of rate design. So when we think about fixed and variable costs, again, that cost classification process is important both in the allocation, but it's also important when we're looking at business risk. We're evaluating the business risk. We're saying, okay, we've got fixed costs, fixed costs for the infrastructure, fixed costs for labor, insurance, equipment, et cetera. We've got the variable costs that are both purchase power and the generation of electricity, as well as some transmission as I talked about. But then we look at the fixed costs and the variable cost recovery, and we say, okay, the fixed cost recovery are really in the customer charge, demand charge. You guys have some connected load charges for certain rate classes. And then the variable cost recovery is both the energy charge and the environmental charge. And so when we think about the relationship between the cost incurrence and the cost recovery, we're showing here on the far right the system cost incurred. There's that 52 to 48% split we showed with the car example. So 48% of your costs are fixed and 52% are variable. But if we look at the current rate design, we're saying that approximately 81% of the cost recovery is variable and only 19% is fixed. Now, this is not unheard of. We see this across the industry. That's sort of the way that a lot of rates and rate designs are set up. We're also seeing a lot of utilities suggest to move that fixed cost recovery to a greater percentage. Now, we're not trying to get all the way to 48%, but we are trying to move that forward from 22 to 23 to 25% through the course of this study over the 3 period. And we do that in the rate design. We do that in the rate design in some of the components, the rate elements of the rate design. So when we think about the proposed electric rate changes, we're saying, well, we're going to have these rate increases for the next rate changes, I should say, in the next 3 years, January 1st, 2025, 2026, 2027. And we're saying, based on the cost of service analysis and the projection of revenue recovery under current rates, all classes need rate increases except for the street lighting. And the street lighting needs a slight decrease, as we showed in that previous slide. We're going to increase fixed cost recovery in electric rates. Again, this total system costs are approximately 48%, but the cost recovery is approximately 80%. Now, this varies by class. Some classes have demand rates, some classes don't. Some classes, so it does vary. But overall, the objective is to move that fixed cost recovery up. And then, as I mentioned, the environmental charge, the idea is to move that away from being a line item on the bill and incorporate that into base rates, whether or not that's the energy charge, the customer charge, or the demand charge. And so ultimately, when we think about costs and developing cost of service and rate design and cost recovery, we need to be able to make sure we're recovering the costs from the classes on a fair and equitable basis. And so what we do is we look at effective rate by class. An effective rate by class just means we're taking the total dollars and dividing it by the total kilowatt hour sales. This isn't necessarily meaning what your rate's going to be. This is just sort of a measurement. It's a metric, if you will, of different customer classes and for different systems. So you can see at the total system, we're saying, right now you're at approximately 14.37 cents, and the test year cost of service is 16.57. So we're designing these rates to then recover that. And you can see for all the major classes, we're hitting exactly onto the effective rate for the cost of service. Now we get into some of the smaller classes down in the municipal and the street lighting, and we get into some issues around the rate design and some of the essentially the rounding, if you will, of the rates that are throwing that off a little bit, but they're close. And so the whole idea again is to make sure we're recovering those costs within a reasonable amount of latitude relative to rounding on rates. So one thing to point out is that when we look at that effective rate, and when we look at this study, we're excluding the PSA. And we talked about that. Brian talked about that earlier, how the PSA is going to essentially going to assume that's going to be zero for the course of this period of time. Now, it may or may not be, depending on what happens. But we're also including the public benefits charge. There's a charge, 2.85%, that the state mandates on every kilowatt hour sales, and we're again moving that, incorporating that into the analysis of the effective rates. But you won't see that necessarily on the rates themselves. So when we think about the proposed rate results, we think about the objectives we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve the revenue requirement for the system, right? We want to make sure that the system remains whole and can remain solvent and can make the investments it's planning to make. We want to make sure that each class's revenue requirement is recovered so that there's a fair and equitable cost recovery. We want to increase some of the fixed cost recovery elements within the rate design. And we want to align the changes in the tariff, so each class has different tariffs in it, and we want to align those changes so they're reasonably similar. Right? Now, some of that is a function, again, of how many customers are within the class, and again, we get into some rounding issues relative to the rates. So these next slides here look at rate changes by tariff, and again, each rate class is made up of a series of rate tariffs. So the domestic, for example, has domestic service, DE, domestic plug-in, DT, and domestic self-generation, DG. So you can see the percentage of the tariff. Now, these exclude the PSA, but include the public benefits charge, as I mentioned before. And you can see we're looking at about 5.6% on average for the DE, about 3.3% for DT, and 4.8% for DG. So we're trying to get those all relatively in alignment. And you can see the commercial classes then are all around 4.5%. The small industrial around 4%, the large industrial at 4% down at the bottom of the HT, tariff class again, the HG at 4.6%, the large industrial and the like. And so you can look at the farming, all the farming rates, the FE, FD, FT, and FG, those are all around 1%, slightly higher on the FG. And again, that's kind of a function of some of the rounding of the rate design. And then similar with the municipal pumping and the municipal load as well. So I'm not going to necessarily go through each one of these rates. I've got every one of the rates in your slides here because there's just a lot of the same discussion. But one of the purposes we want to put this together is to memorialize the rates, so you have a document in front of you that you can look at and other folks can look at as well. One of the things, again, going back to some of those objectives, right? We're trying to meet the revenue requirement of each customer class, because the class is how we determine the cost causation, not by tariff, but by class. We're increasing the customer charge. Again, that's that fixed component element that we're trying to increase. We're moving the environmental charge. You can see it's at 2.69 cents right now. We're moving that to zero and incorporating that into the energy charge in this class. So this is for the DE tariff class. This is, majority of the residential rates. We've got the DT, again, similar kind of concepts here in charging. DG, similar again in terms of increasing customer charge, moving that environmental charge. Then we get into the commercial class, and so we do the same thing here relative to the objectives and the rate, the proposed rate changes moving through the CT, CG, the non-metered, the flat rates, Then we get into industrial, we get the small industrial, the ID, IG, we get into large industrial rates, and we get into very large, we get into the bulk power rates, and then we get into the ag rates, as we talked about before, relative to similar kind of concept in terms of the objectives we're trying to achieve here and some of the rate changes we're making. We've got FT, FG, and then the pumping rates, and then the municipal rates, and then ultimately into the lighting rates. We talked about relative to a relative discount to the lighting rates because they're over-recovering, projected to over-recover for their cost of service. So that is the end of the presentation that I have. So I'd be happy to answer any questions now, or we can save them till later. So.
Thank you, Scott. Any questions?
All right, so I now have some sample rate compares. Just what does this mean? One thing I would like to point out is these are just sample rate compares. Every single customer is going to have a different impact. This is just on average, and it's the average customer, but every customer is going to feel this differently. So I did want to just kind of point that out there. This is over a 3-year period, and so what you can see here on this slide is we're looking at residential on what we compare. So our current rates are on that far left, that very kind of pale blue. And then, for the average usage, it's about, I guess, not average customer, an average usage. I misspoke earlier. That's 16 cents. And so when 2025, it'd be 16.9 cents. And then the next line up, 17.9 is 26, and then 18.9 is 27. We did that in comparison with other local utilities. We did it with MID. Their rates that are set to go into effect on January 1 of 2025 would be at 22.7 cents for residential in this comparison. SMUD, as of May of 25, is at 19 cents. And then Merced, as of May of 24, is 22.2 cents. And then PG&E, as of July of 24, is at 43.6. And so we did this for each and every one, or we did this for not every single one of the rate tariffs, but we do have a handful of them in here. And we're looking at what an average usage would be. And we're also looking at what, 1.5 times the average usage, and then also 2 times as well. And so what you'll see throughout the rate compares that we have here is, I would say, for the majority of them, I think there is one in which it doesn't happen, but that we are pretty much at or below what other people's are, and that's looking at 27. There is one in which I believe it's 26 that we're still comparable, but then 27 we go a little bit higher, and we'll get to that here in just a minute. But we just wanted to kind of show just a general idea. But I do want to, again, mention every customer is going to feel this differently based off of their usage and how they operate. But this is just average usage. This is the commercial. You can see that same comparison where if you look at the average usage, 16.5 cents versus 20.3, 18.3, 21.2, 41.3. I also don't want to minimize that this is going to be an impact for people, right? I'm not trying to say that this isn't, going to have an impact, but just that we still are comparable on an average usage basis. You can see here, small industrial, we're still very comparable. You look at large industrial, again, we're still, very comparable, but, we do have some where we are over in 27. Again, but that's comparing to rates that are in 25 and 24. Same thing for farming. And then looking at restricted pumping. And then municipal, where we end up on the municipal side. So now I want to get into the summary and next steps. As I mentioned, we did talk about that there is going to be an increase, and part of that increase, especially on the residential side, is going to be on the customer charge. And we know that that's going to have an impact on our low-income customers. And so what we're looking at is changing that discount, the discount structure for the CARES program for 25 through 27 in order to account for that, because we know that is going to impact our low-income customers. We want to also keep that in mind. And so what that's doing is the proposed customer charge is going to go from 17 to 22 to 26 to 30, right? That's what we had in that proposed rate tariff. Well, the CARES discount right now is $11, making it just a $6 charge to the customer, but they also get 15% off of their first 800 kilowatt hours. You can see that as time progresses, it would go from $11 to $16 on that discount with that same 15%. It would be $20 in 26 as the discount with a 10% on that first 800. But then really in 27, it's taking care of the entire customer charge for those that qualify for the CARES, the low-income customers. And so you can see what that average monthly discount does translate to. It went from $22.61 currently up to the full $30 customer charge in 2027. One of the reasons is we wanted to make sure that every customer was able to obtain that full discount that was available to them, because that's what the customer charge would be, because there are some customers that don't utilize that full 800 kilowatt hours, and so they don't get the full discount there. But this is just really in helping out our lower income customers. That's what we have proposed in this analysis.
Are those set by the government, or is that just us, the CARES discount and the percentages?
That is a program that we have put together. I don't know if there's any regulatory.
The public benefit itself is required.
Correct.
And the percentage that we charge on the bill is required, but how we develop the program is we do have purview in that.
Okay.
Great question. So now I want to have a summary slide. The proposed rate increase is going to be over 3 years. What we had, showed it over the 3 years on the rate compares. So we are going to be gradually, and I should say, I mentioned before, but I want to mention again, individual customers are going to experience a rate impact that is different than the average, right? Because they're going to have different usage. And we are gradually moving, how we collect the funds through the rate design into the fixed charge. Scott had mentioned we're at 52% variable, 48% fixed, but we have 81% is on the variable and 19. We're trying to move that closer. So that's part of what we are doing here. The other aspect is the power supply adjustment. And Scott mentioned it, and I hadn't mentioned it earlier, but I do need to mention this, that we are going to transfer that account balance to zero, kind of resetting everything. Reset that account balance. We're going to reset that reference rate to zero, and that's going to be in alignment with the rate change. So January 1 is when we would reset that to zero. It's currently at a half-cent credit. So this will be an impact in addition to our customers, in addition to the base rate increase in year one. Now, we don't know what's going to happen. We get further down the road, and if the reference rate that is going to be set during this process, if the actuals come in less than that, we could go back to to a credit, and they get money back. Or if power costs go higher, it could be more. But we are going to set that to a zero during this process, but we are going to reset that reference rate, and so that will change. That will be increased based off of the new numbers, and also adding in some of the stuff that was in the environmental charge, since that's going away. That's going to be incorporated into the reference rate as well. Next steps. One is receive board feedback from you today. We do have a large customer meeting tomorrow morning. We're going to be going through an abbreviated version of this with some of our customers. We do have a water rates workshop a week from today. We have a grower meeting on November 13th, and then we'll be back before you for electric rate hearing, proposed adoption of the cost of service analysis, proposed adoption of rate tariffs, related rate riders, PSA, resolution, adoption of the conditions and surcharges, proposed adoption or adjustment to the Energy Assistance Program. That's that CARES program I was talking about. And then proposed adoption of electric service rules. That would be on November 26th is when we would bring that back. And then we would have on January 14th is when we are looking to have the water rate hearing and the water rate adoption. And with that, I wanted to see if Michael Colantuno wanted to talk a little bit about the rate process. I haven't seen him, but I'm hoping he's there. So there he is.
Here. I don't have too much to tell you, except to start with, these rates are not subject to Proposition 218. They are subject to Proposition 26. Proposition 26 does not tell us anything about the process of making rates. It has substantive rules for measuring the rates when they're adopted, but it doesn't tell us how to adopt them. So your usual practice for power rates of issuing notice, conducting a hearing, and adopting rates is going to be plenty. The Constitution only requires that the rates be fair or reasonable in their allocation of the costs of service to those who benefit from the services. it is a good idea to have a cost of service analysis to allocate your costs between water and power, because water arguably is subject to 218, and because if your rates are related to costs, it's easy to persuade a court that they are fair or reasonable. So the gist is that this is very much a legislative process. You have a fair amount of flexibility, and at the end of the day, the rates simply have to be fair or reasonable in their relationship to the benefits and burdens, benefits from your services and burdens on your services that particular classes of customers pay. Unless there are questions, that's all I've got on Prop 26 and power rates.
Questions for Michael?
Questions?
So now we just have if people want more information. And so we do have information on the website at www.tid.org/rate update. You will have out there the updated tariffs are out there, as well as the cost of service report is out there as well for anyone to go out there and review. You can provide written comments via mail at the address provided there at our P.O. Box, or via email at publiccomment@tid.org. And then all written comments must be received by 9 a.m. on Tuesday, November 26th. And so I just wanted to let people know that. But that is out there on the website for people to go and look at, the proposed tariffs as well as the cost of service report. Is there anything that you have for us, any to take away?
I think the management team should be commended for going 10 years and managing the company with not having a rate increase. We all hear, whether you're on the radio or TV, utility companies to the north and south of us doing 1 and 2 a year. You should PG&E is like 4 times what some of our costs are. So, kudos to you guys for managing the company in a way that we were able to go 10 years. I also remember sitting in a meeting about a year or 18 months ago thinking we were going to need to do one at the start of 24, and we were able to push it out another year by utilizing reserves for CapEx and stuff. I think this is the right time. I think in looking at the budget, we're kind of at the end of, not to say the end of our rope like that's a bad thing, but you can see by the day's cash and the debt service coverage, now's the time to do it. We definitely need to do it. We're embarking on 5 years of CapEx that are going to need the additional revenue of the rate increase. So kudos for keeping it at 0 as long as you did. I think good management instills that now's the time to go on the 3-year revenue increase. So thank you.
Thank you.
Michael, do you have anything to add? Any questions from Arizona?
I do have one question for Scott. Thank you, President Macedo. Scott, could you just talk a little bit more? You used your car illustration to highlight the fixed versus variable cost. And obviously this is rate making is subjective, but could you speak a little bit about where we are in the fixed cost versus variable now, and how much you are moving us toward? You're telling us that you're moving us towards a higher percentage of fixed cost, but on balance, you're not swinging us all the way to where our true fixed costs are. Is that right? You're just moving us incrementally in a direction that we think is more fiscally sound. Can you speak to that a little bit about how you got there?
Yes, absolutely, Director France. Thank you for the question. So when we think about the total system, the investments that we're making and the cost incurrence, and really the only variable portion of the cost incurrence is around either purchase power, and even purchase power has some fixed elements to it, but it also, in terms of the variable cost of dollars per megawatt hour that you're buying, the fuel that you're buying, and the like. And so what we're trying to say is that there's an imbalance between what you're currently recovering, right? You're currently recovering about 19% fixed, and that's really all around rate design, right? You think about a residential rate, for example, it has a customer charge and an energy charge. So really the only fixed component of that is indeed the customer charge. So the variable component is the energy piece. And so we're incrementally moving towards that. I don't, unless you were thinking about something like a demand rate, for example, for residential customers, which there are some utilities out there that are considering that. That is a fixed cost recovery element. Not recommending that for this study, clearly, but that's a big shift in terms of how you might recover costs from residential customers. And when residential customers are, a pretty sizable portion of your base, that's what's driving a lot of that cost recovery right now in terms of the rate design. So to your point, we're trying to incrementally move that up with the existing rate structures we have in place, increasing those rate levels slightly over time, again, for residential customers and for all the customer classes. So we're increasing the customer-related charges, the demand-related charges, the connected load-related charges, incrementally over time to try and move forward towards a better cost recovery, because it really is, again, a risk management tool. Because if you're subject to kilowatt-hour sales and people put in more efficient systems, then your kilowatt-hour sales go down, but your fixed costs don't change, right? You still have those investments in place that you have to pay for. And so it really is trying to rebalance that in terms of the exposure to risk that the district has. Does that answer your question, Director?
It does. It does. I just wanted to really to highlight that it appears that you're making a very gradual, incremental change, which I appreciate. And to the extent that it could be perceived as negative towards low-income users, I appreciate, Brad, you increasing the CARES actually percentage-wise to a bigger percentage of the customer charge than it is today. And so I think it's a very balanced way of addressing this desire to slowly move the needle towards actually mirroring where our costs are shaped. So well done.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No, I just want to thank you. It's never comfortable to have to raise rates, and we've been very fortunate here to maintain the rates we've had for so long. Because as you can see, the challenges going forward with the state mandates and what we have to deal with there. But TID has a long history of good vision and reacting to those things and being frugal, and it's just comforting to see that we're still trying to keep that going forward here and doing that. So I appreciate all the work you've done so far, and I think this will be not really pleasant, but it'll be okay when we're making it as bearable as we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I wanted to just mention, just on the back end of that, again, thank you, Amy, Brian, Scott. There's lots of effort that went into this presentation, but also, don't want to sell the board short. You guys implementing local control and becoming a balancing authority and building the assets that we have, that is what allows us to optimize the facilities, where in other utilities they don't have those knobs to turn. And because we do is a huge reason why we've been able to bridge this gap and not have a rate increase for 10 years. So.
Well said. Thank you.